Thank you so much to everyone who made it for this session. If I may continue with the permission of Her Majesty. So I'm so happy here to be with Will Schwalbe talking about his book, The End of Your Life Book Club. It's a beautiful, moving book, and I think we should jump right into Will giving a short summary of the book for those of us who haven't read it.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Thank you so much, Kunzang. I'm so looking forward to talking with you and Your Majesty. It is such an honor to talk to an author whose books I so love and to be at this extraordinary festival. So a little bit about the End of Your Life Book Club. As background, in 2007, my mother, who was then 73 years old, was diagnosed with stage 4B pancreatic cancer. And this is one of the worst diagnoses you can get. And most people who get this diagnosis only live 3 to 6 months. But my family was incredibly lucky, and my mother lived for almost 2 more years. Now, when I was growing up, my mother always started just about every conversation with a simple but powerful question. And that question was, what are you reading? And so it was natural that as I spent time with my mother in the last 2 years of her life, accompanying her to her 4 to 6 hour chemotherapy sessions, she would ask me, what are you reading? And I would ask her the same. And we started talking about books. And it was all different kinds of books, because my mother and I read, and I still read, whimsically, promiscuously. We read whatever catches attention, what we hear about or read about. And we quickly found out that books allowed us to discuss things that were in many ways too painful or difficult to tackle heads on. And they gave us a language for talking about these things, but also they gave us a kind of joy and respite. Because when we were reading, we were no longer a sick person and a well person. We were no longer even a mother and a son. We were 2 human beings on a journey together. And so the End of Your Life Book Club is a book about the books we read, the conversations we had, and the things that matter most in life. And just quickly, before we continue, I want to tell you a little bit about my mother. I should add, I feel she's very present in the room right now. My mother was a woman who worked at a time when not many women worked by choice as well as necessity. When I was growing up, she was an educator. She was the director of admissions for Harvard and Radcliffe. She then became a high school teacher and a college counselor. But in her 50s, a remarkable thing happened. She got a postcard out of the blue, and it said, I am a nun on the Thai-Lao border, and I need your help. And my mother had no idea who this nun was or how she had found her. But the nun wanted one simple thing. She wanted a very small amount of money, I think it was $30 or something, to buy coloring books for the children in this refugee camp. And pretty soon, more and more cards came from this nun. Can I have $50 from that, $75 for this? And my mother was always delighted, and she even put schoolgirls from her school in contact with the nun and these children on the Thai-Lao border. And one day the nun sent a postcard, and it said, our water treatment plant has broken down. We need $1,300. And my mother wrote back and said, I would love to help, but I don't have that kind of money. And the nun immediately wrote back and said, I'm so sorry, I'm a nun, I don't really understand money. But if you would love to help, why don't you move to the Thai-Lao border and work with us? And so my mother said to my father, I love you, don't worry, I'll be back. And she said to the school where she worked, I need a sabbatical. And more crazy than anything, she said to my college-age sister, will you come with me? And the 2 of them moved to the Thai-Lao border and worked there for many months. And my mother found her second life's calling. And she devoted her life she devoted her life to the cause of women and children refugees. And for the rest of her life, she was the founder and director of something called the Women's Refugee Commission, which is part of the International Rescue Committee, which had been founded by Albert Einstein. And she spent the rest of her life traveling all over the world, 10 times into Afghanistan, originally through the Khyber Pass. She went to Sierra Leone. She went to Cote d'Ivoire. She was an election monitor in Bosnia. She went to Burma. She went all over the world to advocate for women and children refugees. And so when she was diagnosed at the age of 73, it was, for our family, a terrible thing to contemplate the loss of our matriarch. But for my mother, there was bound up the idea that there was the loss of her life, but she had so much more to do. And that's one of the big topics of the book, along with the fact she wanted to do one more big thing before she died. So working the phones from chemo, she set about to raise enough money to build a library and cultural center in Kabul, Afghanistan, and traveling libraries to go to villages so girls in Afghanistan had access to literature.
So your mom was clearly an amazing person and achieved so much, but what's also very evident in your book is that she was also a very modest person. She was always downplaying her achievements. So my question is, how do you think she would feel about your book, which is essentially an homage to her?
Well, when I first told her that I was going to write this book, because I said, Mom, it's kind of like a two-person book club, and I'm proud of you, and I want to write about you and your accomplishments. She said, oh, don't be silly, sweetie. Why would you write about me? There's so many other things to write about. But then the next day I got an email, and there was a list of all the books that she and I had read to date over the course of her treatment. So I think she would have been embarrassed, but I think she would have been glad that through this book, I could provide a voice for some of the causes she cared about the most, women and children and refugees around the world.
And then another peculiar characteristic of your mom, you said she liked to read the endings of the book first, and then she would work backward. And actually that made me think of our Buddhist principle. We're supposed to be thinking of death every day, and that's supposed to help us figure out how to live in the present, because we know death is inevitable. So I was wondering, do you think her reading the book from the end backward somehow impacted her enjoyment of the book, her understanding of the book?
She would love that question. Just a quick show of hands. Does anyone else read the end of a book first? A couple of brave souls put their hands up. She said she read the end of a book first because she wanted to be able to savor the prose. She wanted to be able to get to know the characters. She didn't want to be so racing ahead to find out what happened that she was unable to pay attention to the words on the page. I should say it's been an incredibly moving experience for me to be in Bhutan for the first time. Your Majesty, I was so moved by the session which opened about reincarnation. There are some places in the world you go, it happens very rarely, it may only happen once, where you arrive in a place and you feel like you have been there before. And stepping off the plane in Paro, I felt in a very, and not in a cliche way, but in a very profound way, a coming home. And I was thinking about some of the comments that were discussed at your speech, Your Majesty, and a lot of it to me seemed to me about by willingness to talk about death and engage with death, it actually encourages you and helps you to pay so much more attention to the present. And I think that really was how my mother lived her life. And the fact that she received this diagnosis of stage 4B pancreatic cancer, if you get that diagnosis, you know how the story ends. The story ends with death. But that's one of the things that allowed her to make so much of her last almost 2 years. And that's one of the things that allowed her to say, if I have a limited amount of time left, I'm going to do something big for the world. And one other thing about that I wanted to add, my mother would feel incredibly vindicated because a study came out that showed that people who read the ends of books first enjoy them more.
So we definitely recommend reading the ending first, everybody, even the murder mysteries. So this is my next question. I promise you it's the last one that's related to Buddhism. I couldn't help myself, but there were a lot of references to Buddhism in your book. I think you mentioned the 70 verses of emptiness. It's a sacred text written by Nagarjuna. You write about the importance of mindfulness and meditations, the books you read about that. And also when your mother passed, you had this beautiful passage where after she passed, the light falls on a painting of the Buddha, which makes the painting glow. So I'm just wondering, do you see Buddhism as literary texts that readers can look to understand life? Or do you find it appealing as a spiritual or religious philosophy teaching you how to live life? I mean, are you a closet Buddhist? I think you are.
I may well be. My mother was a very devout Presbyterian. She was actually born Jewish, but as a young girl, she converted to Christianity, and she was a real believer. Soon after her diagnosis, a friend, just out of the blue, said the Dalai Lama is speaking at Radio City Music Hall. It's incongruous. And my mother went. And my mother was deeply moved. And there was a particular passage that ended with, happiness is not, suffering is not, from the pamphlet that she took away. And that became a phrase that she would return to a lot over the course of her illness, and I would too. She did have, my sister-in-law, who's a painter, marvelous artist, had painted this beautiful little picture of a Buddha, the Buddha, and my mother hung it in her bedroom, and when the light hit it, it would just glow. And in the last days of my mother's life, when she was confined to bed, and we had dinner with her about 4 days before she died, when she insisted on going to the table. But her last days, she lay in bed, and on her left were many of the books she loved. And she was able to look at the bookshelf and see the books she loved. And right in front of her was this little picture of the Buddha that she would look at as the light hit it. And I was really moved by both these things. My mother was always a little aggravated that I didn't embrace any particular religion. And it wasn't because she was aggravated at me. It had just given her so much joy and comfort in her life that she wanted the same from me. And my brother, who is a religious person, he cracked me up at one point in this journey because he said, Will, have you noticed anything about the books that Mom keeps choosing for the book club? And I'm like, no. And he said, they're spiritual. And so I did notice that she was sneaking in various things. But I think that the course of this journey with my mother made me a more spiritual person. It made me a person more open to the spiritual traditions of the world, and it also made me see the commonalities.
And when you introduced the book, you did talk about your mother's major achievements, working with refugees, building the library in Afghanistan. But also in the book, there are lots of little kindnesses she extends to her family members and also strangers. There's actually a person who's waiting in line crying. They're waiting to get their medication, and your mother talks to her and finds out that she can afford to pay for her mother's cancer medication, and your mother, of course, being the person that she is, she decided to pay for it. So in the book, it's obvious that she is constantly talking to people, meeting people, going places. So I was wondering, What advice do you have for people who are introverts, people who would like to be part of a larger community, to do good, but find it so difficult to put themselves in situations where they have to meet strangers and visit strange places?
Yes, my mother would talk to everybody everywhere. As a little kid, I was just mortified. I was like, well, Mom, do you have to talk to everybody? I found it incredibly embarrassing. And even in the last months of her life, she loved a part of Florida called Vero Beach, and we'd walk on the beach, and she would talk to everybody she met. And I called her on it. I said, Mom, must you talk to everybody? And she said to me something which I think about a lot. She said, how can you know who you want to meet until you've met them? And I really try to channel that, and my one crazy way of channeling it is I'm now that terrible person who sits next to you on the airplane and engages you in conversation.
That's so wonderful to hear, Will. I think I take that as inspiration too, because I find it difficult to approach people, and I'll always remember that from your book, what your mom said, that you don't know which wonderful people you're missing out on. My next question is, it's commonly accepted that authors, once they write their book, it's out there, and the readers now become co-authors, basically. They create their own meaning and their own understanding of what the work is about. But be that as it may, if there was one thing that you want your readers to get out of this book, what would it be?
I would have to say it's this. We are all in end-of-our-life book clubs. There's not a single person in this room who can say what the last book you will read or the last conversation you will have. So it's a plea to make those books and those conversations count and to engage with each other. It's a plea for attention to everything around us and the people around us. And I want to tell one brief story to me that I think about a lot. Many people said to me, did you write this book because you wanted closure? And my answer was, I don't want closure. I never want closure. What I want to do is continue our conversations. And I'm never sad when I'm talking about my mother or remembering her. I'm only sad when a couple of days go by and I realize I haven't thought about her. And when I was 16 years old, I read David Copperfield, and I was obsessed with it. I loved David, I loved Steerforth, I loved Little Emily. And I remember turning the last page of that book and bursting into tears. And I burst into tears because I thought, this is the last I will ever spend with these wonderful characters. This is the end of my relationship with David Copperfield. But of course, nothing could be farther from the truth. I think of David Copperfield just about every day, and Steerforth, and Little Emily, and Dora, and I talk to them, and they're part of my life. And the same is with my mother. Her death was not the end of our conversations. It wasn't even a break in our conversations. I think about her, I talk to her, and she's present in the room. So the thing I want people to take away from this book is that we don't have to lose the people we love who are no longer in this realm. If we choose to remember, if we choose to talk about them, they're with us always.
That's such a beautiful thought, and I know the Queen Mother also. Her Majesty has also written a book called Of Rainbows and Clouds, which is her retelling of her stories told by her father, and I feel it's all in the same tradition of keeping people alive through our stories, which is so beautiful. I'm also now reading your book, We Should Not Be Friends, which is, I think was described, introduced briefly. So I noticed in both the books, it's about your personal relationships, and they seem to be a major source of inspiration for you Do you think you could ever write a fictional book with fictional characters, or do you need to know the people personally?
I would love to try to write a fictional book with fictional characters at some point, but I had the privilege this morning of doing a writing workshop, and I told people something very important to me, which is if you're the hero of your own memoir, you've done it wrong. And there are so many people in the world that I want to write about. I keep finding new ones. The book that I most recently did, We Should Not Be Friends, is about my 40-year friendship with a guy who became a Navy SEAL. Someone totally different from me, who was a little prejudiced against me, but I was way more prejudiced against him. So I just keep encountering people in real life I want to write about.
So I think this is the final question. My question is, you've answered some of it already, but I think there's a passage in the book that explains it so beautifully, why books are important and what we get out of talking about books that we love. So I was wondering if you could share that with the audience.
So this is for those of you who read the ends of books first. This is the end of this book. A friend of hers wrote an obituary, a friend of my mother's, for the Times of London. And she ended it by saying, Mary Ann, that was my mother's name, saw the worst and believed the best. And this is from the book. I think Marina, my mother's friend, got it exactly right. Mom taught me not to look away from the worst, but to believe that we can all do better. She never wavered in her conviction that books are the most powerful tool in the human arsenal, that reading all kinds of books in whatever format you choose is the grandest entertainment and is also how you take part in the human conversation. Mom taught me that you can make a difference in the world and that books really do matter. They're how we know what we need to do in life and how we tell others. Mom also showed me, over the course of 2 years and dozens of books and hundreds of hours in hospitals, that books can be how we get closer to each other and stay close, even in the case of a mother and son who were very close to each other to begin with, and even after one of them had died.
So I think we can open the floor up to questions, if anybody has them. I think there's a gentleman in the back there.
Good evening, Your Majesty, the most precious host and the royal patron of Botanicos, august gathering, and the enthusiastic audience from all walks of life. And good evening to you, sir. You are the son of the soil. Sir, I feel like for the last few minutes you have really mesmerized us and you have taken me from this life to the enlightenment process. I'm connected with you in the sense that I'm the eldest of the 4 siblings and I'm 50 years old and I still behave like a 5-year-old child to my mother because I'm her favorite son. Because I washes her undergarments. So, in this regard, before she left this earth, she is now 74 years old. I have constructed a 1 million Ngiltam stupa, Kunzang Tshomo Dukpa, for her, right in front of her house. So, not blowing my own trumpet, but just to say, in connecting with your, gratefulness to your mommy. Sir, if, regarding your reincarnation and mindfulness thought process is true, if your homecoming is true at Paro International Airport, and if you want to make your loving mom happy, you don't have to build anywhere else like Kabul and Afghanistan. You know what, sir? You can plan a big library and cultural center in Galifo Minus City. You are here at the right time, right place, right person. In Buddhism, we have 5 things to be accomplished. 5 elements to accomplish something. So 3, right time, right place, right person. In front of Our Majesty, the Royal Patron. So we are grateful to your mom, and I salute to your mom because I'm from a military background. Thank you so much.
I think he was saying that you've written a book to commemorate your mother, and he is building a stupa in front of the house for his. And he was recommending, I think, that you build a library in the Kelifu megacity in memory of your mother. I don't think that was a question, but it was a good idea.
That's such a lovely idea. Thank you. I should explain, I'm extremely hard of hearing, so I do a lot of lip reading, and that's why the question had to be repeated. But thank you so much. That's a lovely idea.
Sorry, there's a question here.
Thank you. It was very enlightening. We all are sort of at our relationships with our parents, and I'm curious, in the process of, at the end of your mother's journey and reading the books, was there a point of epiphany where you recognized that, you know, you have this relationship of equals, or was it sort of a enduring process where, you know, brick by brick, you lowered the wall?
I realized it quite early on, and I jokingly said to my mother, you know, if we keep meeting like this while you're having chemo and we keep reading books together, it's kind of like a book club. And I'll never forget, my mother instantly said, "Oh, sweetie, don't be silly, it can't possibly be a book club." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because there's no food." But right from the start, one of the first books we read was Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner. And it's a gorgeous novel, and a woman named Charity is dying of cancer. And her husband's name is Larry. And my mother turned to me and said, "Is Larry going to be okay?" We discussed whether Larry was going to be okay after Charity had died. And I realized right in that moment, we weren't talking about Charity and Larry. We were talking about my mother and my father, and that the books were giving us a way to talk about things that were, in that moment, too painful. And I realized in that moment, we were two readers on a journey, not this sick person, well person, mother and son. So I'm often very dense and don't pick up on things as quickly as I should, but I clued into this pretty quickly. I should also add one other thing about it, is one of the first books we read was a book called The Etiquette of Illness, and it taught me an incredibly valuable thing, which was to ask my mother, "Do you want to talk about how you're feeling, not how are you feeling?" And I employed that throughout her illness. And that also allowed us to stay on the same page.
Any other questions? Oh, one there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Will, for your courage and for, I think, basically sharing and showing us your vulnerable side. Yeah, it's really powerful as a listener. My question is kind of related to what you're currently talking about. Could you tell us about your favorite book that you and your mother read in those final moments of our life?
That's such a lovely question. I think it probably was Crossing to Safety, but I should add that we had marvelous conversations about books that we didn't necessarily agree on, too. We read The Kite Runner, which she loved unreservedly, and I loved until the ending, which I thought, wasn't quite sure I loved how he brought it home. So even when we weren't agreeing on a book, we were loving the chance to engage with one another. And my mother, actually, her favorite book in the world was a book called Marjorie Morningstar by Herman Wouk. And we had a really special time talking about that book. So every book gave us a little facet, a little something different to talk about. everyone revealed a different facet of my mother's character. But I would say if I was to direct you to one, it would be Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner.
I think we have one question here.
It's not a question, but rather a sharing of an anecdote. I think your mom's story and you has triggered a bit of my memory as well. So some 10 years ago, my mom died at the age of 84. I'm a doctor by profession, but when my aunt called me to the house and told me that mom is not feeling well, and I just met her, I knew instantly that this may be her last few hours. So we sat down talking to each other for 3 hours, and we have a system of giving some relics to her. So I was feeding her with these relics and talking to her. And that's when my Buddhist teachings came onto me. So I took on the hat of a Buddhist practitioner and taking her through the death ritual called Phowa. And I was really amazed that both of us are so calm and so intuitive that we knew as if this was the last few moments. And I still, just as you remember your mom, so in my moments of distress and stress, I actually recollect those few moments, and you triggered that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is lovely. And one of the other things that I wanted to stress in the book is when my mother received this diagnosis, I had this realization that the thing that we were actually mourning was the future. That we would always have our past together. That every wonderful or crazy or moving experience, I would always have that. So I wasn't losing my mother. I was losing my mother-to-be. I was losing the mother of the future, the mother who would get to go to her grandchildren's graduations or attend their weddings. And she was mourning that too. So in her last 2 years, we were able to talk quite frankly about that and how to keep her present at those. And one of the things that her hospice worker had her do is, while she was feeling well, write a letter to each one of her grandchildren to be opened when they were 18, so that she would be present in their lives years to come. We realized there was something that we could do about that. But I loved what you shared, and I found that very moving. Thank you.
Any other questions? So I just wanted to thank you then, Will, for writing such a beautiful book. I think your work of art is the book you wrote, and what your mother did was her life was the work of art. She lived a wonderful, very accomplished, full life, and I think I think I also told you that when I finished reading the book, I was filled with such a sense of regret that I never got to meet her. She sounded wonderful, but I felt so much joy that I got to meet her in a way through what you wrote about her. And I think it triggered some memories for people in the audience. I think it's going to keep giving more and more people read it. And I had one question for you actually, but which you kind of answered. You said in your book, you said that one thing you learned from your mother is that reading isn't the opposite of doing, it's the opposite of dying. So
Yes, can I address that? Do we have a minute left? When I was a kid, I was so lucky in so many ways, and I still am so lucky in so many ways, countless ways. One of the wonderful friends I've made here said to me, "You're always smiling." And I said, "Of course I'm always smiling. How could I not be smiling?" But in addition to all the luck I had with my parents, I had parents who were readers and who modeled reading for me. And reading was our get out of jail free card. If you were reading, you couldn't put it off endlessly, but you could delay any chore you had to do. And my mother would never say, put down that book and do something, because she felt that reading was doing something really, really valuable. And she would have so loved to meet you. She would have so loved to be here. I'm so sorry she never made it to Bhutan, because I know she would have gone crazy for it. If you asked me about the favorite books we read, Treasures of the Thunder Dragon would have been a favorite book we read together if she was still here to read it, and I kind of like to think she was, because that book gave me so much joy, Your Majesty. It's so beautifully written. I'll never forget the description of you and your sister on the upside down of the horse being dragged as you were going off to boarding school, but it's written with such generosity and love that I know that would have been part of our end of our life book club. So I think that message, I'm an evangelist for reading, and if I can end with one, my great question is the question that my mother and I asked each other all the time: what are you reading? And my hope for all of you and for everybody in this glorious, beautiful, extraordinary country to which I can't wait to return is that the question, what are you reading, will become the first question that everybody asks one another when they first meet. Thank you.
Thank you so much.